Jerome grew up in a small, quiet town where everyone seemed to know each other. His father was a carpenter, his hands rough and calloused from years of hard work, while his mother worked as a school cafeteria manager, always greeting kids with a warm smile. They were hard-working, loving parents who taught Jerome the importance of honesty, kindness, and perseverance. But despite their love and guidance, Jerome carried a painful secret. Ever since he was a young boy, he had been teased by other kids in the neighborhood. They called him Little Man in whispers that soon turned into loud jeers in the school locker rooms. The teasing wasn't about his height or size, it was about something far more personal. Jerome didn't fully understand why they mocked him, but their words cut deep, leaving scars that no one could see. As the teasing continued, Jerome started to change. He began avoiding gym class and swimming lessons, terrified of being humiliated again. He dreaded any moment where he might be exposed to more ridicule. His parents noticed that he was withdrawing from activities he used to enjoy, but they assumed he was just a shy boy. Teachers didn't think much of the teasing, dismissing it as typical playground behavior. But for Jerome, it wasn't harmless. Every laugh, every pointed finger felt like another blow to his self-esteem. By the time Jerome reached high school, the teasing had shaped him into someone who preferred to stay in the background. He avoided girls entirely, too afraid of rejection. The few crushes he had stayed locked in his heart, his fear of humiliation outweighing his desire to take a chance. Instead, he threw himself into his schoolwork, hoping to prove himself in other ways. Jerome's determination to succeed helped him graduate with top grades, but deep down, the wounds of his childhood still lingered. The words of his tormentors became a voice in his own head, questioning his worth and haunting him at every turn. Even as he left home and stepped into adulthood, those insecurities followed him like a shadow, shaping the man he would become. Jerome found his purpose when he became a police officer. Putting on the badge felt like putting on armor. In his uniform, he wasn't the shy, insecure boy from his childhood anymore. He was someone strong, someone respected. His peers looked up to him, admiring his discipline and dedication. But deep inside, Jerome's old insecurities never really left. They stayed hidden, waiting for moments of doubt to creep back in. Everything seemed to change the day he met Veronica. She was beautiful, confident, and full of life. She moved through the world like she belonged in the spotlight, turning heads wherever she went. Jerome couldn't believe it when she took an interest in him. It felt like a dream. For the first time, he thought someone truly saw him for who he wanted to be, not who he was afraid he was. With her, Jerome felt like he mattered. Their marriage started off with so much hope. Veronica admired Jerome's quiet strength and steady demeanor, and Jerome adored her elegance and charm. Together they looked like the perfect couple. But it didn't take long for small cracks to appear. Veronica had always been used to attention, the kind that followed her effortlessly. While Jerome admired this about her, it also stirred something. Inside him, jealousy. Jerome's fears slowly began to surface. Whenever Veronica laughed with a neighbor or chatted with someone at a party, his heart would tighten. To her, these moments were casual and innocent, but to Jerome, they were proof of his deepest fear that he wasn't enough. He questioned her loyalty, not because of what she did, but because of what he believed about himself. Their arguments often started over the smallest things. A friendly conversation with a neighbor could send Jerome into a spiral of doubt. Veronica tried to calm his fears, but her patience wore thin. She began to pull away, tired of constantly proving her commitment. The distance between them grew wider with every argument, every moment of mistrust. Jerome wanted to hold on to their love, but the weight of his insecurities made it harder each day. The walls between them were getting higher, and he didn't know how to break them down. Jerome and Veronica's marriage began to feel more like a quiet struggle than a partnership. The closeness they once shared seemed to slip further away with each passing day. Intimacy, which had once been a source of comfort and connection, now felt distant and forced. Veronica became increasingly withdrawn, turning away from Jerome's attempts to rekindle their spark. She would tell him she was too tired or stressed, but to Jerome her excuses felt like a judgment, a silent reminder that he was failing her. Jerome couldn't stop overthinking everything. He noticed every heavy sigh and every moment of silence. In his mind, these weren't signs of everyday stress, but signals that he wasn't good enough. The weight of his insecurities pushed him to obsess over fixing their relationship. He convinced himself that making Veronica happy in their private life was the only way to hold on to her. But no matter how hard he tried, a growing distance made him feel more inadequate. One day at work, Jerome opened up to his partner Derek, an older, more experienced officer known for his blunt advice. Hesitant at first, Jerome admitted how things had changed with Veronica, how he felt like she was slipping away from him. Derek listened quietly, then leaned back in his chair. Sometimes couples explore other options, Derek said carefully, choosing his words. It's not for everyone, but it might help. Jerome froze, unsure if he had heard correctly. The suggestion felt shocking, even offensive. You're joking, he said, forcing a laugh. But Derek's serious expression said otherwise. Jerome quickly shut the idea down, feeling disgusted and ashamed that it had even been brought up. Yet, as the day went on, Derek's words lingered in his mind. That night, Jerome lay in bed, unable to sleep. Derek's suggestion replayed in his head over and over. Could something so drastic actually work? Could it save their marriage? The thought filled him with dread, but the fear of losing Veronica was even worse. As he stared at the ceiling, Jerome felt trapped. He didn't want to admit it, but he was starting to wonder if he might actually consider the unthinkable. Jerome spent days wrestling with the idea that had taken root in his mind. The thought of even suggesting something so unconventional made his stomach churn. But as the tension in his marriage grew thicker, and the emotional distance between him and Veronica felt impossible to bridge, he realized he had to act. He told himself this wasn't about his pride, but about saving his marriage, about holding on to the woman he loved. One evening, Jerome finally sat down with Veronica, his heart pounding in his chest. She was curled up on the couch, scrolling, on her phone, unaware of the storm brewing inside him. He cleared his throat, unsure how to even start the conversation. "Veronica?" he began softly, his voice trembling. "Can we talk about us?" She looked up, startled by his serious tone. "Of course," she said, putting her phone down and turning her full attention to him. Jerome hesitated, running his hands over his knees. "I know things haven't been the best between us lately," he said. "I feel like we're growing apart, and I don't know how to fix it." Veronica's face softened, and for a moment he thought she might comfort him. Instead, she stayed quiet, waiting for him to continue. Taking a deep breath, Jerome explained his fears, his insecurities, the way he felt like he was failing her, and how desperate he was to make things right. "I spoke to Derek," Jerome said hesitantly. "He suggested something different, something that might help us reconnect." Veronica's brows furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Jerome braced himself. He mentioned that some couples explore unconventional ways to rebuild their intimacy. Veronica's eyes widened, and Jerome hurried to add, "I don't want to do this, but I don't know what else to try. I just want us to be okay." Expected her to lash out or laugh at him, but instead she tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. The silence between them felt like an eternity before she finally spoke. "If you think this could help us," she said slowly, "maybe it's worth considering." Her words were like a punch to his gut. Deep down, he had hoped she would say no, reassure him that they didn't need anything so extreme. But her agreement felt like validation of his worst fears that he wasn't enough for her. Still, Jerome nodded, his throat tight. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll look into it." That night, Jerome sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, feeling more like a man on trial than a husband trying to save his marriage. He signed up for a discreet platform designed for people seeking alternative arrangements. The profiles were overwhelming, some overly confident, others intimidating. None of them felt right. After days of searching, Jerome found someone who seemed different. His name was Nate. His profile was simple and respectful, his photos showing a man who looked friendly and genuine. He wasn't overly polished or intimidating, and something about him felt approachable. With shaking hands, Jerome typed a message, explaining their situation in vague terms. To his surprise, Nate responded quickly. He was polite and understanding, asking thoughtful questions about boundaries and expectations. After exchanging a few messages, they agreed to meet. The day Nate was set to arrive, Jerome was a bundle of nerves. He couldn't stop pacing the living room, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and fear. Veronica, on the other hand, seemed calm, almost excited. She spent the day preparing, cooking an elaborate dinner, and setting the table with care. Her demeanor unsettled Jerome even more. How could she be so composed while he felt like his world was crumbling? When Nate arrived, Jerome opened the door, his chest tightening as he saw the man in person. Nate was just as approachable as his profile suggested, dressed casually but neatly, with an easy smile that disarmed Jerome's initial hostility. Veronica greeted him warmly, her voice light and cheerful, as she led him inside. Dinner was a blur of awkward conversation and forced laughter. Veronica kept the atmosphere lively, asking Nate about his interests and sharing stories from her life. Nate responded with charm and attentiveness, and for a moment it almost felt like a normal dinner with friends. But for Jerome, every laugh, every glance between them felt like a dagger to his heart. When the moment came to move upstairs, Jerome followed reluctantly, his stomach in knots. He sat in a corner of the bedroom, gripping a glass of whiskey, trying to brace himself for what was to come. As he watched Veronica and Nate interact, he felt jealousy rise like a wildfire. Her laughter, her smiles, they weren't for him anymore. He told himself this was for their marriage, but deep down, he wondered if he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The bedroom was cloaked in an uncomfortable silence, broken only by Veronica's soft laughter and Nate's murmured words. Jerome sat in the corner, gripping his whiskey glass so tightly it seemed as though it might shatter in his hand. He told himself he could endure this, that he had made this choice for the sake of saving his marriage. But every glance between Veronica and Nate, every touch, every shared smile, felt like a knife twisting deeper into his soul. His mind raced, consumed by jealousy and humiliation. Memories of his childhood insecurities bubbled to the surface, intertwining with his worst fears. He had spent years trying to be enough for his parents, for his colleagues, and now for Veronica. Yet, here he was, watching another man offer her the affection he could not bring himself to believe he deserved. The humiliation was unbearable. As he downed the last of his drink, the warm haze of alcohol blurred the edges of his thoughts. Instead of calming him, it amplified his emotions, sharpening his anger and despair. His heart pounded in his chest as his breathing grew shallow and erratic. He couldn't stop the storm building inside him, the swirling vortex of rage, shame, and pain. Nate's laugh rang out, light-hearted and carefree. It was the breaking point? Jerome stood abruptly, his movements clumsy, but driven by something raw and uncontrollable. His hand instinctively reached for the pistol he had left on the bedside table earlier. The cold metal felt heavy in his grip, a tangible weight that matched the crushing burden in his chest. His vision blurred with tears and anger as he pointed the gun at Nate. "Jerome!" Veronica's voice cracked, startled by his sudden movement. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized what was happening. But it was too late. The deafening crack of the gunshot shattered the tense air. Nate's body jerked and then collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Blood pooled quickly beneath him, staining the carpet a deep, horrifying crimson. Veronica screamed, a raw, piercing sound that echoed through the house. She stumbled backward, collapsing. Onto the bed, her hands clutching at her mouth in disbelief. Jerome stood frozen, the gun still trembling in his hand. The room was silent now except for Veronica's sobs and his own ragged breathing. The weight of what he had just done hit him like a tidal wave. He had taken a life. The man who had entered their home as a guest now lay dead, and there was no undoing it. As the reality of his actions sank in, Jerome's mind reeled. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had made this choice, this absurd, humiliating choice to save his marriage, to keep Veronica from slipping away. Instead, everything had fallen apart. His hands began to shake violently, and the pistol clattered to the floor. Veronica's sobs grew louder as she crumpled onto the floor, her body trembling. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice choked with grief and terror. Her tear-filled eyes locked onto Jerome, searching for an explanation. That would never come. Jerome's survival instincts kicked in. "I can fix this," he muttered to himself, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Fix this? How could anyone fix this? Moving on autopilot, Jerome grabbed a bedsheet and began wrapping Nate's body. The act felt surreal, like he was watching someone else perform the task. The lifeless weight of Nate's body made it painfully real. Veronica stayed frozen, her knees pulled to her chest, her sobs quieting into a stunned silence as she watched him work. Jerome carried Nate's body to his car, under the cover of darkness, every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the fabric, making his heart pound. He felt like the entire neighborhood was watching, though the streets were empty and silent. Driving aimlessly through back roads, he finally found a remote wooded area. There, with shaking hands and shallow breaths, he hastily buried Nate. When he returned home, the weight of his actions finally crushed him. Veronica sat motionless in the same spot, her tear-streaked face pale and blank. Jerome sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The silence between them was unbearable. The man who had tried to hold his marriage together now sat in the ruins of his life, and nothing would ever be the same again. When Nate didn't return home, his wife grew worried. At first, she tried calling his phone, thinking he might have stayed late or lost track of time. But as the hours ticked by with no word, her concern turned into fear. Early the next morning, She went to the police and reported him missing, her voice shaking as she explained that this was completely unlike him. The police wasted no time launching an investigation. Nate's wife provided them with details of his last known movements, describing how he had left for what he said was a work-related meeting. Detectives retraced his steps, starting with the neighborhood where he was last seen. They canvassed the area, asking neighbors if they had noticed anything unusual that evening. Meanwhile, Jerome tried to keep himself together. On the surface, he went about his daily routine, but inside, he was a mess. Every sound startled him. Every knock at the door sent his heart racing. Veronica, too, was a shadow of herself. She barely spoke, moving around the house like she was in a daze. The tension between them was suffocating, but neither dared to address the horrifying reality of what they had done. As investigators dug deeper, cracks began to show in Jerome's attempt to cover his tracks. A neighbor had seen Nate entering the house that night, but never saw him leave. Surveillance cameras captured Jerome's car driving away from the neighborhood late at night. When the police questioned him, Jerome was polite but distant, his rehearsed answers raising suspicions. Detective Alicia Thompson, a sharp and experienced investigator, sensed something wasn't right. The breakthrough came when the police searched Jerome's car. Despite his attempts to clean it, traces of blood were found in the trunk. Forensic experts confirmed it matched Nate's DNA. The evidence was irrefutable, and the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. Detective Thompson, following her instincts, obtained a search warrant for Jerome's house. The signs of a hurried cleanup and inconsistencies in the stories told by Jerome and Veronica only strengthened the case against him. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Jerome broke down. He admitted to the crime, his voice trembling as he recounted the events of that fateful night. He explained how jealousy and insecurity had consumed him, leading to a moment of blind rage. His confession, though honest, couldn't erase the horror of his actions. The trial that followed was both swift and dramatic. Jerome sat in the courtroom, his once proud demeanor replaced by a hollow expression. He listened as prosecutors laid out the evidence against him, painting a picture of a man who had let his insecurities spiral into violence. His colleagues, many of whom had admired him as a disciplined and respected officer, watched in disbelief. Veronica's testimony shocked everyone. Taking the stand, she admitted that she had agreed to the arrangement not out of love or to save their marriage, but to test her own desirability. She confessed that she craved the validation of knowing she could still captivate a man's attention. Her words cut through the courtroom like a knife, leaving even the judge momentarily speechless. For Jerome, her testimony was the final blow. He had thought he was fighting to save their relationship, but now he realized he had been a pawn in a selfish game. It was a bitter revelation, one that deepened his sense of failure and regret. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning their verdict. Jerome was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. As the judge read the sentence, Jerome felt an odd sense of relief. The chaos, the lies, and the guilt were over. His life as he knew it was gone, but at least he no longer had to live with the weight of his secrets. Veronica, though not legally culpable, was left to rebuild her life. She moved to a new city, trying to leave the scandal behind, but the memories stayed with her. No matter how far she ran, the choices she had made and the life lost because of them haunted her. The Jackson home, once a symbol of love and success, now stood empty. It was a silent monument to the destruction caused by jealousy, insecurity, and poor decisions, a reminder that even the strongest relationships can crumble under the weight of secrets and lies. Jerome sat alone in his small prison cell, staring at the blank pages of a notebook in front of him. The stillness of the room pressed heavily on him, yet the emptiness of the page seemed even more suffocating. He picked up his pen, the weight of his actions trembling in his hand. Writing had become his way of coping, a fragile bridge between the man he used to be and the one he hoped to become. With every word, he tried to untangle the web of choices that had led him to this point. He began by revisiting his childhood, the insecurities that had quietly grown into a monster he could no longer control. He wrote about the teasing, the cruel nicknames, and the quiet shame that had shadowed him into adulthood. Then came his marriage to Veronica, the love that had filled a void in his life but also fueled his fears of inadequacy. He detailed the jealousy that consumed him and the secrets that ultimately tore them apart. Through his words, Jerome tried to piece together the events of that fateful night. He didn't shy away from the truth. He wrote about the rage, the jealousy, and the moment he pulled the trigger. He described how desperation clouded his judgment and how everything he thought he was protecting shattered in an instant. His words were raw, filled with regret, but also with a quiet hope that others might learn from his mistakes. For Jerome, writing became a form of redemption. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could offer his story as a warning to others. He poured his heart onto the pages, hoping they might reach someone on the verge of a similar path. His lessons were simple but profound. Insecurity, left unchecked, can poison even the strongest bonds. Jealousy, if allowed to fester, can lead to destruction. And silence in relationships can be just as damaging as the loudest arguments. Meanwhile, Veronica tried to move forward. She left Peachtree Heights, choosing a new city far from the tragedy. On the surface, she seemed to thrive. She surrounded herself with friends and immersed herself in a new social life. But at night, when the world around her was quiet, the memories returned. She couldn't forget the choices she made, the decisions that played a part in the unraveling of her marriage and the loss of Nate's life. The echoes of that night lingered, a shadow she couldn't fully escape. Back in Peachtree Heights, the Jackson home stood empty, its once beautiful facade now a chilling reminder of the secrets it had hidden. Neighbors who once admired the family now whispered in hushed tones about what had happened. It was a painful realization of how little they had truly known the people they thought were perfect. The Jackson story became a cautionary tale, a somber reminder that appearances could hide deep cracks and dark truths. For Jerome, prison was a daily reminder of his actions. The walls confined his body, but his mind was free to reflect, to question, and to seek understanding. He spent hours filling the pages of his notebook, not just with regret, but with the hope that others could avoid the mistakes he made. He wanted his story to serve as a beacon, a plea for honesty and vulnerability before it was too late. Veronica, too, carried the scars of the past. She couldn't erase what had happened, and despite her outward appearance of strength, the guilt stayed with her. The choices she made, the betrayal she allowed, and the life that was lost because of it, all of it remained woven into the fabric of her existence. The Jacksons' tragedy left an undeniable mark. It was a story of love, betrayal, insecurity, and loss. But within it were lessons about the power of communication, the importance of addressing fears, and the danger of letting jealousy take control. Their story wasn't just a tale of heartbreak, it was a warning to anyone who believed that silence and secrets could save a relationship. At Crime Lab Chronicle, We share stories like this to remind you that even the darkest truths carry lessons. If you found this story impactful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Together we can uncover the hidden truths behind the stories that shape lives. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay connected.